very much indeed for coming along, and thanks for those who are listening live or listening after the event. So this is the first formal event then of the University of Leeds Sadler seminar series, Curating and Exhibiting Visual Culture in Times of Coronavirus. So the purpose of today's workshop is to share experiences of curating and engaging with visual art and cinema online or otherwise in these challenging times. And thanks for those who are listening live or listening. Oh, I've got an echo. This is the first formal event then of the University of Leeds. Can you hear that, Alice? That's me
repeating. If you've got it playing on your browser, if you've got the YouTube open, maybe just close that down.
Okay, it might have opened automatically by itself, did it? With visual art and cinema online in these challenging times. No.
I think we're good.
Okay. I'm not sure what happened there. Sorry about that. Okay. So just then a brief word on the Sadler seminar series. So this is an interdisciplinary scoping project that explores the challenges and opportunities presented by lockdown, post-lockdown, whenever the hell that happens, for curation and exhibition of visual art, both in the UK and abroad. So there's currently much discussion then about the impact of COVID-19 isolation measures on the physical spaces where we experience visual culture, so cinemas, art galleries, etc. And many galleries and museums have sought to mitigate closures with the impromptu curation of online exhibitions, live streamed guided tours of their collections, and increasing numbers of films made for theatrical exhibition are now being screened and viewed online, as we know. We're interested in exploring such initiatives and in examining the impact, if any, that this shift is having on the promotion of and access to artworks produced by women and ethnic minorities. So I'm going to introduce our participants in this workshop. I'm Stephanie Denison, and I'm the convener of the series and director of the Centre for World Cinemas and Digital Cultures at the University of Leeds. And the main focus of my research is Brazilian film culture. And I've been accompanying with interest the impact of COVID on Brazilian society broadly and on audiovisual culture in particular. Co-convener Thea Pittman, give us a wave, Thea. Works on Latin American new media arts and has spent the last couple of years working with Indigenous communities in Northeast Brazil on a project to produce new media and electronic art. And she was particularly interested in Indigenous communities' approach to showing their work in a major modern art gallery in Salvador, and has written a book about Indigenous, or is writing a book about Indigenous decolonial approaches to curatorial practice. Another co-convener, Simon Poppel, works in the School of Media and has become increasingly focused on the co-production of digital tools which allow communities to develop independent access to cultural and historical resources as a means of storytelling, campaigning and social advocacy. And he's currently working on the role cultural heritage organisations in relation to local audiences, education and the potential of heritage in special educational needs education under COVID-19. Co-convener Jill Park is based in the School of Fine Art, and as a researcher, Jill is interested in moving image work and photography, and in particular histories of art that address the entanglements of gender, race, class and sexuality. And Jill has a curatorial background, most recently as director of Pavilion, a visual arts organisation based in Leeds. And I'm delighted to say that we have the current director of Pavilion here with us today, Will Rose. And I'm also very excited to welcome Kitty Anderson, director of Lux Scotland. And we're really interested to hear from both of you regarding the impact that COVID has had on the work of your organisations. Moving a wee bit further afield, we are joined by Jane de Almeida, who is a professor at Mackenzie Presbyterian University in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And she's a curator and researcher of gallery films, films made to be viewed in gallery spaces. And she most recently curated an exhibition of the moving image work of the late Aldo Tambellini. In Ireland, over to Ireland, we have Carlos Garrido Castellano, lecturer in Spanish and Portuguese and Latin American studies at the University of Cork, with research interests in socially engaged art and coloniality. Back to Yorkshire, the University of York with Tallulah Lines, an artist and researcher with interests in decolonial feminist art. We're also joined by Rachel Johnson, lecturer in Italian and Film Studies at the University of Leeds, and a scholar who has been researching the impact of COVID on film screenings, festivals, and so on. And we have Inês Dias, also here at Leeds, and a scholar of Lusophone studies, with particular interest in Brazilian and Mozambican film cultures. And last but certainly not least, we have Alice Miller, PhD researcher at the University of Leeds, programmer for the Leeds International Film Festival, among many other exciting curatorial ventures on her CV. And Alice is the administrator of our Sadler seminar series. So you're all very welcome, and I very much look forward to hearing from all of you. But first, let's hear from our very special guest, Virginia Crisp. Virginia is Senior Lecturer in Culture, Media and Creative Industries at King's College London. Her most recent work is the co-edited collection Practices of Projection, Histories and Technologies with Oxford University Press 2020. She's the author of Film Distribution in the Digital Age, Pirates and Professionals, as well as numerous articles and book chapters on formal and informal media circulation. She's also the co-founder and director with Gabriele Menocci of Besides the Screen Network and the co-editor of Besides the Screen, Moving Images Through Promotion, Distribution and Curation. Over to you, Virginia.
I almost forgot to unmute myself then. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, but particularly thank you for the lovely introduction to everyone else. I'm just in such amazing company. It feels bizarre to be the special guest, but anyway, I will do my best. So thank you all for listening. I'm going to just try and share my screen so I can share some slides. Hopefully this will be relatively successful. Give me 1 second. Sorry, of course, I'm having some sort of technical issue. Right. Oh. Irritatingly, it's sharing the wrong screen. Just a minute. I'm tempted to have done with the slides entirely, to be perfectly honest. Apologies. Okay, I might actually just not bother with the slides because they're not the most important thing in the world. And to be perfectly honest, I need to be able to see my notes at the same time. So it's more important I know what to say than you see some pictures. So I was really kindly asked to contribute to this webinar about curating and exhibiting visual culture in the times of coronavirus. And I agreed to contribute for a couple of reasons. Firstly, as I've already kind of suggested, I was really excited to have a conversation with such an exciting bunch of people about such an important topic. But also, and I hope this resonates with people, so little of what I've been able to do since March has actually been research. I think academia is experiencing many of the issues that the arts is in terms of people either being unemployed or overemployed and overworked. And I think that actually then this is a real risk for the kind of scholarship that we might even produce in these times, because it will inevitably be skewed by the kind of inequalities that I'm going to be talking about in a minute. And so I actually thought this is a really good time to make myself refocus on something that's not just the teaching and administrative aspects of my work, because otherwise there will inevitably be somewhat of a skew in the kind of research that happens. But indeed, these factors also made me a little bit nervous as the time approached, because as with so many of us right now, I wasn't sure I'd have the headspace, the time, or the energy to give this this matter the actual headspace and energy it deserves. Nonetheless, I thought it was an important opportunity to reflect upon things and think through some of these important issues that are so often put to the side when you're experiencing crisis, to not actually to think about the bigger picture. So when I started reflecting more deeply, it struck me that from my perspective, the most pressing concern is how pre-existing issues and inequalities and problems have not necessarily been created, but have undoubtedly been exacerbated by the current pandemic. As such, in this talk and conversation today, by way of my reflection, I wanted to highlight some of these continuities and exacerbations. So I know this webinar is an opportunity to start or even continue a discussion about the challenges and opportunities presented by a sort of lockdown, post-lockdown scenario for curation and exhibition of visual art, both in the UK and abroad. And indeed, in thinking about this, I wanted to actually highlight three continuities from my perspective. One is change, somewhat paradoxically, but I'll come back to that later. The second is myths of universality, and the third is existing inequalities. I'll then conclude with some thoughts about how we might approach researching the subject into the future. So my perspective is very much coming from someone who is starting to embark on looking at the subject, rather than as with some of the wonderful other collaborators who are actually already involved in that work. Before I go on to the points that I'd like to share in a little bit more detail, a bit of context about me and what themes and ideas my research and networks bring to this kind of question. So as mentioned, I'm Senior Lecturer in the Department of Culture, Media and Creative Industries at King's College in London. My research is broadly connected to ideas of circulation of media objects and experiences. Much of my work has focused upon the interrelationships between formal and informal circulation. My 2015 monograph, Film Distribution in the Digital Age, very much focuses on this through the lens of particularly film circulation. I'm currently also co-writing a book with Professor Paul MacDonald, who's a colleague of mine at King's, about media piracy. Personally, I prefer not to use the term piracy, but publishers do prefer the term piracy, so apologies for that one. My interest in circulation is really an interest in power and how certain people, institutions, practices influence what media, particularly media in my case, is funded, created, promoted, published, and ultimately, due to all of these earlier, we could say, factors being in place, consumed by audiences. So my interest in curation and exhibition is very much quite holistic, considering how the kind of pipelines, if we can use that term, operate as much as anything else. So thinking about connections to the topics on discussion today, my work often examines the increasingly unclear and overlapping boundaries that surround things like curation and exhibition. For instance, when attempting to define and understand concepts like distribution and exhibition with my students, we're often discussing how portals like Netflix or YouTube are neither distributor nor exhibitor in somewhat historical or industrial terms, but are at the same time both, depending on how we define both terms. In doing so, we're often discussing how distributors and publishers in both formal and informal settings often obscure or downplay their roles in selecting and gatekeeping various aspects of culture. And in that respect, how their practices, whether they be professional or otherwise, might be understood as acts of curation, more broadly defined. So in returning to our question about the challenges and opportunities presented by the current situation, particularly for curation and exhibition, I want to make 2 points that help frame my following discussion. Firstly, as you might understand from this introduction to my research concerns, I'm interpreting curation and exhibition very broadly, as well as considering visual art from my own media corner, we could say. And my research particularly concerns film and television, but also games in relation to games publishing and circulation. So I've also decided to frame these main points as much as I can as opportunities. You will notice that they're actually somewhat negative in tone, but I've deliberately tried to frame them as opportunities to recognize certain issues and thus address them head on. So I'm trying to roll the challenges and opportunities into one, seeing each challenge as an opportunity to address that challenge, if you see what I mean. And I really do want to focus on this idea of continuities. So firstly, I suggest that we have an opportunity now that it's really important for us to take to recognize continuity as much as discontinuity brought about by this time of coronavirus. So the first continuity, somewhat paradoxically, that I want to start with is change. So I think we should always remember the ubiquity of change, either as a humdrum, unnoticeable evolution, or in its frequent construction through tipping points and moments of no return. I say this because we're often encouraged to focus on what makes things different rather than what makes things the same. Perhaps, somewhat unsurprisingly, narratives that concern specific events or happenings tend to focus on these moments as sort of tipping points, as moments of no return, moments that change everything. And the most obvious example is something like 9/11. However, in constructing such moments of change, we also construct the reality they propose to describe. So this can be considered problematic for a number of reasons, which I won't go into here, but to give, for instance, seeing 9/11 as a tipping point, a day that changed everything, provides a very US-centric worldview and serves to obscure conflict going back millennia, amongst many other things. And although a very different phenomena in type, geography, and scope, I would also ask us to be wary of the way that current COVID-19 issue is being constructed as somehow temporally bounded, a discrete event, as though it has a clear beginning and a clear end. And obviously I can completely understand why we might want to see it as having an end, but seeing it as a particular event also has the potential to construct it as one of these moments of no return, moments of change. So what strikes me as particularly notable within these news narratives is their somewhat internally inconsistent representation that on the one hand, everything has changed, and on the other, one day we can return back to normal. Obviously, there are many narratives regarding this new normal, and I'll come back to this later. But if everything is changed, then some imagined normal can never return. But I also think it is a myth and a mistake to assume that everything has changed. Indeed, the whole of the point of pointing out continuities from me is to emphasize that some things, especially structural inequalities in our societies, are very much the same. So in short, one of the continuities I think we have the opportunity and the responsibility to recognize right now is change. So we can look beyond potentially attributing responsibility for all changes at the moment to coronavirus. How film, TV, and games, as my main areas of interest, are curated and exhibited has always been changing and adapting. And as I will mention later, some elements of change have undoubtedly been exacerbated and may have even been created. But in exploring such questions, we must always remind ourselves that correlation does not equal causation. Indeed, this is not a revolutionary thing to claim, and I know that. Even in the blurb for the rationale behind this conversation, it was made very clear that these discussions should be contextualized within previous research about ongoing advances in technology and new media and other shifts that predate the current context. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, I have used this as a point of reflection to remind myself, as much as anybody else, of what we need to be mindful of when assessing the current situation and the impact on the arts. So this brings me on to the second continuity I'd like to take the opportunity to recognize right now. And this is, from my perspective, the really stubborn myth of universality. So I see this concern being partly perpetuated through continuing reference to the idea of a new normal. The major concern I have about how this framing is trying to universalize our experience of a global pandemic, when any individual's experience is going to be heavily skewed by their location, their government's policy, their health, their gender, their ethnicity, their wealth, their access to healthcare, the relative wealth of the country they live in, and very soon their access to vaccine, to name but a few. There are indeed many ways to take exception to this. But for the purposes of this talk, I want to think about the idea that there has never been and never will be universal access to or experience of film, TV, and games. We know for a start that content is geo-blocked to only be available in certain territories. We know that the poster child of TV viewing, Netflix, while available in most countries across the globe, has been shown by theorists like Ramon Lobato to have very variable experiences of access and content depending on where you are. We also know that there is a significant digital divide both within and between countries. We know that norms and practices around what it means to go to the cinema, for one thing, vary across cultures. I could go on for some time without managing to list all of the reasons that we mustn't pretend there is some sort of normal consumption of media that is being replaced by another new normal, a new version of normal consumption that has never existed. There are indeed cultural norms, expectations, and practices, but it is erroneous and above all arrogant to assume that any of those are universal. It may be customary for some people to prefer to watch films in the dark, in silence, in red velvety seats, with popcorn and Coca-Cola. But this is a construction as much as a reality. And importantly, it is a primarily Western construction of cinema going that frames itself as right and the only way of watching films. Indeed, Hollywood has sought to protect these norms such as these in the face of change across the last 100 or so years, before often adopting new practices when the wind changed and it suited their own interests. So I think this is important right now because we cannot assume that opportunities or challenges as experienced in one context will necessarily be reproduced in another. Indeed, it may well be that countries with high levels of internet access are experiencing increased use of online streaming platforms for film, TV, and games. But what about in countries where access is much lower? This is a point where I was going to show you some lovely charts and graphs, which you won't get to see. But what they basically demonstrated is that in places like South Korea, internet penetration for adults is around 98%, whereas in Ethiopia, it's about 8%. And so this then reminds us that within countries, there are also other divides. I was then going to show you another table, which demonstrates that even in the UK, which is the bottom of a chart demonstrating disparity, men are considerably more likely to have access to the internet than women. And that's even in a context where a lot of people take internet access very much for granted and very much see it as universal, when really that isn't quite the case. And there are similar statistics linking to economic income and internet accessibility and age as well, which I'll come back to later. Thus, talks of us all watching Netflix and Zooming with our friends as a new normal in the times of coronavirus also glosses over this final continuity, which I want to highlight. And again, I get no points for originality, but I think it's a drum worth banging. So the final continuity is inequality. So this is an opportunity to remind ourselves, and I realize some of us don't need reminding of this, that the age of coronavirus is exacerbating existing structural problems and inequalities rather than creating them. That's not to say it isn't directly creating poverty, illness, death, and bereavement for many. And it isn't to diminish such tragedies at all. But it is also important to remind ourselves that these existing societal, economic, cultural, and other inequalities are being seriously exacerbated. And I'll focus here on the ones to do with the provision of any digital solutions to physical cultural forms, but of course there are many others. So at this point, I was going to throw another chart at you to show there's a correlation between income and internet access. And thus, any digital solutions to the current problems will only exacerbate existing digital divides. And again, this isn't to dismiss any of the wonderful work that people might be doing, providing access to content online, but it's only part of a solution. So I'm not going to go on at length about this final point, because I do think it's actually quite happily being well documented and discussed at the moment that the current context is intensifying existing inequalities to do with poverty, health, ethnicity, gender, age, and a whole host of other factors. But some conclusions that I want to be mindful of when continuing to research this subject. I'd like to kind of bring together a few final points now. So firstly, when looking at the current context, we must be very aware of the tendency to see causation when there is mainly correlation. Indeed, it's difficult and perhaps impossible or undesirable to attempt to measure the impact of any one thing in isolation. Indeed, many of us come from social science or humanities backgrounds, so trying to sort of isolate one variable is not necessarily what we do. But by way of example, I might refer to the frequent claims around my own research that heightened rates of online piracy in the early 2000s were the primary factor leading to the decline in sales of CDs, when actually more detailed research on the subject shows there were actually a host of other contributory factors. And we must be careful not to look for these obvious solutions when actually a complex interplay of factors might be going on. And I might refer in the UK to the announcement this morning that the retail chain Arcadia is likely to go into administration in the next couple of hours. But a lot of the more deeper analysis on this is heavily pointing out that Arcadia was in trouble for a long time for a whole host of other reasons. That doesn't mean this isn't the nail in the coffin, but we do have to think about the context more broadly. So secondly, I'd like to remind us that the digital is not the only solution or even the best. Indeed, the solutions we're provided here, and here I talk about film and TV, where some of those solutions are very obvious, like Netflix, Disney Plus, and Amazon, should not be the starting point to think about solutions to current accessibility issues around cinema. Tied to this, we also need to avoid assumptions about the universality of any digital shift and the accessibility of digital technologies and their interfaces, their connections, and their experiences. So leading on from this, we need to avoid the assumption that such services can replace going to the cinema for those people who actually did such things, and also be even more concerned about the way these platforms might curate or not their content and the kind of algorithmic methods they might use for this. I make the first point not, and I must emphasize this, not because I personally think seeing a film on a big screen produces some sort of unique aura. Very, very far from it, actually. Instead, I say this because I see so many elements of film consumption as social. So to give one example of this, I think of the silver screen events that used to take part at my local cinemas. There were showings of recent-ish films for pensioners accompanied by tea and biscuits. These were primarily, to be honest, social events that people went to as much for the company and the tea and biscuits as much as for whatever film happened to be on. In Birmingham, where I live, even though I work in London, many of the cinemas that used to run such events have not reopened. Indeed, while it's been headline news that Cineworld, etc. are in trouble, actually the Midlands Arts Centre hasn't reopened, And the oldest, longest running cinema in the UK, which was in Birmingham, the Electric, hasn't reopened. And the Mockingbird in the Custard Factory hasn't reopened. And there are actually very few choices of cinema locations in the second largest city in the UK. That's a bit of a diversion. But also, if we, going back to the silver screen events, if we think about the demographic for such events, they're often older women. These are people that are less likely to have access to the internet. And as such, having a Netflix party is unlikely to respond to the issue of these silver screen events not happening. So I'm nearly there. Thirdly, we should start with pre-existing inequalities as our areas of concern, because these are likely to have been most exacerbated. So in a way, I'm saying people like me, who are super happy with the internet, watched a lot of stuff online in the first place, and will engage with a lot of digital opportunities, and are maybe experiencing lots of wonderful new access to things, maybe shouldn't be our area of concern, because I'm actually really well catered for. We need to find the spaces where people aren't. And I'm sure, especially listening to everyone's introduction, that's exactly what they're doing. But fourth, and connected to those other points, it's important to start by asking others what both challenges and solutions might look like. If I take my earlier example, I, even in my relatively highfalutin place in a posh university, cannot assume I know how it's best to respond to the reduction in silver screen showings for audiences. I cannot somehow divine how to replace these, or even if they need to be replacing, or even if what replaces them actually has anything to do with cinema. These are not my decisions, but that doesn't mean I can't help. And this leads me to the final point. I'd like to end on the point that I also think that it's more important than ever that research doesn't just describe the problems, it works towards solutions. And again, that's why I'm so happy to be amongst such wonderful company, because there are a lot of researchers who do actively contribute. But it's also important to recognize there are a lot of researchers who don't. There are a lot of researchers who just comment on the world. And I think it's more important than ever, and I go back to my original point, that even though we are overworked and overstressed and pulled in multiple directions, it's really important for those of us who do make interventions in our research to double those efforts now, or bring more people into the camp, because it's not going to be through top-down imposition that any of these solutions are founded. It's going to be through dialogue and engagement. Thank you all very much.
That was great, Virginia. Thank you very much indeed. And you've given us, I think, an awful lot of food for thought. And lots of things, of course, will have resonated, I'm sure, with our guests, with me. I didn't realise you lived in Birmingham, and I have been thinking a lot about the Electric, and the ballroom, and whether it's likely to survive, and whether in fact it had problems to begin with that have now been exacerbated, as you're saying, and maybe some of those really tricky questions about audience generation hadn't been sufficiently tackled before all this happened. So some of our own failings as, as practitioners, as academics, as supporters of the arts, maybe have been highlighted as a result of the pandemic. I'm wondering, would any of our speakers like to jump in if anyone has any questions or any kind of dialogue they'd like to have with Virginia, or any kind of anything that they've been reflecting on while they've been listening? I think if you just flick your mic off, that would be the easiest thing, since I don't think we have a hands up function.
I'll start if I may.
Thanks, Simon.
Yeah, thanks very much, Virginia. I thought that was brilliant. I'm sorry we couldn't see your charts. So firstly, can we have your slides at some point? Because they're always the statistics that are very hard to find when you need them as well to make an argument. But what I really liked was the idea that there is no new normal. There is always if you like, exclusion, or people are just missing from the landscape. Sometimes by choice, because obviously people don't want to adopt digital technologies because they just don't get on with them, they don't need them. But often it's because it's forced exclusion because of circumstances. And this particular point, I think the point that you were making about the need to refocus on existing inequalities is really interesting, because COVID, for a lot of people, has made their situation worse. So it has exacerbated those inequalities. And those are the people who I think really need the sort of focused attention. And particularly in areas that I'm starting to look at in terms of people with special educational needs or disabilities, cultural events, cultural institutions are at best tokenistic often in their reach or their appeal for people in those sectors. And COVID has just made it doubly difficult, not because they're closed, but because these people often don't, for example, if you're working with people with autism, they don't appreciate any form of change. And the amount of change that's taken place over just the past 8 months and the changing regulations, people cannot cope. So they're just not leaving their houses. And where they can do, they're using digital access, but often it's not designed for them or by them. It's almost a sort of often a very paternalistic sort of offer for people. So I'm thinking that's an area that I think you're really right to highlight, and that's crucially important. And I know this is really important in the cinema sector as well.
Yeah, and if I could just respond to this, I mean, it is more anecdotally, but yeah, I have a friend who has a young child with autism, and actually, even though schools have been open, it's been too much change. It's too uncertain. If the school's not definitely open, or if it is open, there can't be that level of change for this particular child, because he's only 8 years old and he's quite severely autistic. And so for him, even going to school hasn't really been possible because change is too much of a problem for him. And so exactly the situation you describe is that they have just stayed in. And then, of course, this has effects because he's not the only child in the house. He's not the only person in the house. And so the effects of his enforced isolation is then exacerbated across the family, if you see what I mean. And certainly for him, he used to go to a lot of autism-friendly screenings and things like that, and it was something he was comfortable with. But he can't wear a mask, and these things are really not sort of appropriate right now. And so again, I think it's about refocusing and going back and asking people what are the new issues, but surrounding existing concerns.
And I was thinking what you said about seeing opportunities, because one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, and building on things that we've done with communities in York, is to thinking about how we can use culture, particularly cinema, particularly archives and photography, as a way of trying to let people re-inhabit their environment as a cultural space. So we're exploring sound walks at the moment with people with autism to try and get them back outside to make something creative and use some creative elements. So they'll be using elements of local film from the film archives and the local city archives. So there is opportunity there as well. It's not all, as you're saying, we shouldn't be totally pessimistic about it. There is a lot of opportunity out there. And I think this has just made us focus more on it and certainly concentrated my mind on how a large sector of the population actually see culture and how they experience culture in whatever form.
Yeah, and just sort of riffing off that a little bit as well, it makes me think about how over the summer I went on a lot of sculpture trails and things like that, because actually it was a way to experience an art gallery, but outside. And it's the sort of thing that again makes me think, the digital is not the only solution, or it shouldn't be the only solution to some of these issues. And I say this as someone who, has 4 screens in front of me right now and researches screen cultures and is super fascinated by these things. But I'm interested in how they feed into our social lives, and they enable us to engage with other people. They bring connections, and they also, can create barriers. But to just sort of, go for the easy option because there are digital options means that there is this sort of skew to what can be digitalized and what should be digitalized, and also there's a skew in terms of who can afford to do that, because, I didn't really talk about it, but we often forget how much digital solutions kind of cost. you know, how much it costs for Netflix and Amazon to, well, not Amazon because they pay themselves, but to have servers and these massive server farms that store all this information, and to have a good streamed connection and all of this kind of stuff, it costs money. And if you're a small provider, connecting to people through digital means is not always cheap. And sometimes, especially now, and I think we can appreciate that in higher education as well, sometimes it's also more work and more money to do things that actually were easier to facilitate face to face. So I think, I'm not saying we should just throw all the digital solutions out the window, but I think we can definitely think beyond them, because they don't serve everyone and they're not necessarily what we need.
And I think it'd be interesting to hear from maybe other colleagues what the experience is outside, because we've talked predominantly about the UK. Be really interesting to hear from people's other perspectives from other parts of the world as well. What's the experience been prior to COVID, and what's changed under COVID would be I think would be really interesting to hear. If anybody's got any thoughts on that as well.
I can talk about Mozambique because I was just writing an article on the Kugoma Film Festival, which was a festival that precisely its aim was to bring cinema outside of the elites. Since when cinema was screened in the capital city of Mozambique, it was mostly for expats and cultural elites. So they wanted to take this film festival to the peripheries, to the schools. And for a while they were successful. They stopped doing that precisely because of money. And this year they organized it online, and they said it was more work because they needed to have this technical knowledge that they did not have before. Before it was more about promoting and communications. And this year they had to kind of learn how to do this technologically. And it's interesting because one of the things that they say is they never had so much public watching the films. A lot more people saw it online, especially because people all over the world could see it. But on the other hand, the people in these schools that would every year watch films did not have access this year. So I don't know the percentage of people with access to internet in Mozambique, but if in Ethiopia is 8%, I'm pretty sure it's lower. And it's mostly through cell phones that people use it. So I don't see, I mean, streaming movies is very expensive. I know, for instance, that people share music videos mostly through Bluetooth because they don't want to, they can't afford the money to live stream all the time. So it is something that made me think, as Virginia was talking about, accessibility in places where the access to internet is very low, and how, again, on one hand, there's more people watching these films that usually are not watched. They just stay in these countries, films from the Lusophone African context. But on the other hand, these people who really have trouble to have access to films, the children in peripheral neighborhoods, got cut out of that precisely because they can't bring them to them.
Can I chip in there as well and corroborate similar experiences for Indigenous communities in Brazil? This year was going to be a big year for Indigenous art, Indigenous contemporary art being exhibited in major institutions in Brazil. So some of that's been postponed, some of that has gone ahead. Lots of those things have had an online dimension. And it's exactly the same. You think that, I mean, everybody's talking about it. As far as academics are concerned, everybody's talking about it. And you can still hear the voices of Indigenous people who had kind of made their way into the academic circles. But it's a healthy reminder that we do need to look beyond that. Because, of course, being stuck in the north of England for over a year now, I can't get out there to know what's happening in the communities. But though it will have limited access for the vast majority of people, even if their cultures have been more talked about than they were previously, which is generally a good thing.
If I can just chip in there as well, because what you said about Mozambique is actually quite similar to the kind of film festival that I would say I'm involved with, but it's actually a Minochi who organizes it, and he did a similar thing this year. He took the films that he was going to show in Vitoria, and he put everything online, and I think it was wonderful. It was really successful in a lot of ways, but yes, it was open to a more international audience. So lots more people like me who were not going to be in Vitoria at the time were able to see everything. But what normally happens is we have a huge sort of theatre full of the local Vitoria youth watching these crazy art house short films from directors from all over the world who are emerging. And so there's a local audience for things that Besides the Screen does in Brazil that really does cater to people in Vitoria, particularly, who are, young people in Vitoria who aren't going to be going out in Sao Paulo or Rio or anything like that, because they'd have to get on a plane or a bus for 24 hours. And, these are packed cinemas full of those kids. But when you put it online, we don't get the same sort of take up. And it might not be because they don't actually have internet access. It might also just be because it doesn't have the same sociality. I mean, I must admit, we've not done follow-up research about it, but when you mention Mozambique, although it's a different context and a different sort of audience, it's a similar thing, reaching an international elite maybe, but not reaching the local audience, which was why we did it in Vitoria in the first place.
I wondered if I might be able to add to that, also from a film festival perspective, and thinking through the unevenness of COVID, the way it spread, the different national policies, and also within different kinds of festivals. Because as I've been researching some of the big major international festivals and their responses, it's almost been the opposite, where in order to comply with, at that particular time of year, the national policy, they've been no longer prioritizing flying in these international guests, and international travel's been banned. And so they've been forced to turn more to their local communities. So Sundance was holding drive-in cinemas for the people of Utah who wouldn't usually be attending. And I've been trying really hard to think through what's made that possible for them as these very, very large film festivals, in terms of the resources that they have, the ability to maybe take certain risks with in-person exhibitions that might be cancelled following a national lockdown. I guess that wasn't going to be a risk in the States, unfortunately, but and also the differences in national policy. The Shanghai Film Festival is another example of one of the early ones that had a hybrid festival with in-person and hybrid event and online events, but quite deliberately said, no international guests. This is also because of national policy at the time. So we're going to open it out and really focus on our local communities. So it seems like there's been lots of really different changes among kind of different areas, maybe of film festival circuits and also different countries.
We've got a question that's come through from our live stream from Helena Prates in Brazil. Do you think that the digital streaming is promoting new audiovisual languages and aesthetics? Has anyone had any thoughts on that? Jani, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Well, I think that Virginia.
So, any thoughts on that?
Steph, I think should answer Elena before, and then I can talk a little bit about my perspective. Yeah. No, I can't tell about that. I think that Virginia should ask before, and I can tell about my perspective, which is different from the film screening, but it is from the gallery space.
Okay. Ginny, any thoughts on that?
It's a really interesting question. I think if I can kind of almost explain why I don't have an obvious answer to it, I think because there's I mean, there's a sort of homogenization in terms of a lot of interfaces. So Kathy Johnson's work on internet TV has kind of recognized that to a certain extent, there's almost, if I can really loosely paraphrase, two kind of rough interfaces that a lot of online streaming TV services tend to have. And that even if you look across countries and across contexts, there is a somewhat homogenization of certain elements of the interface. I do also think, though, that the problem with streaming is that it's actually quite an expansive term. And so on the one hand, while we might look at internet TV as having an element of homogenization, if we also include things like YouTube and Vimeo, they have a different context and have a different aesthetic. We also then include TikTok and Facebook and other forms of sort of social mediaized streaming. There's different things going on. And I think also going back to that example of sort of sharing music videos, not through streaming, but actually through someone downloading, because, you know, access to that data is at a premium, and then sharing things in different ways. I think the problem with streaming is it's too big of a category to sort of pin down to whether it is producing, you know, new languages or aesthetics. I mean, admittedly, that's a plural, so we could say there are multiple new languages and aesthetics. I think there is undoubtedly, when we start looking at things like TikTok, where the format is smaller, shorter, more immediate, and often more ephemeral, not meant to be kept. And I think there's, you know, but whether there is, when you start looking at the kind of very corporate high-end level of sort of things like Netflix, I'm not so sure. I think at that kind of end of the scale, you're looking at a reproduction of previous things and trying to fit what we've already done for ages into this new box. Whereas I think it's actually maybe in the less traditional spaces where, for film and TV, I'm talking about, things like TikTok, where we might actually see some movement, some change. Because even if we think about something like YouTube, it has had to sort of, there are new aesthetics and languages, and a lot of that is kind of to do with the constraints of the platform. Firstly, to do with how long things could be, and then to do with how one can monetize it. But I'd say I'm less interested in that than maybe the sort of more social media spaces that might actually be sort of changing film aesthetics. But I'm not really sure. I don't think that was the best answer, but I think streaming is a really huge thing. And so we would definitely need to sort of categorize it out into different elements and a varying spectrum in relation to its kind of corporate intent, and therefore its corporate constraints, which again kind of dictate language and aesthetic quite a lot.
I think that it's amazing to watch and understand what Virginia is saying, and for us, for Elena, it's very important to understand what aesthetics and the language is, because of our research in Brazil has to do with the aesthetics and the language. And my perspective is very different from Virginia's perspective, because my experience was about the curatorship of an exhibition of an Italian and American artist, and it was, he has never been exhibited in Brazil before, and it was a unique opportunity. People were able to see Aldo Stambellini's work for the first time, and however, I'll always compare it to my other experience with organizing live exhibitions. I think that the live experiences were more vivid, how can I say? But at the end, I think that it was an excellent opportunity, to work to organize a body of work like a database. And in my point of view, it was, a very particular exhibition, because the artist has never been exhibited here, and he had a Brazilian father, and he was always, kind of, expecting some opportunity for this. And this exhibition was very special for him too, I think. He was very sick, and he passed away in the middle of the exhibition, and all things became very emotional. And for us, it was like, an opportunity to show and to work together with somebody who was, having this, this work, and for the, for him, he was expecting to get better, to come to Brazil, but unfortunately he died. And for what I understand, it was a very special job for him. And as a consequence, I think that we have, after that, this database with his work here. We could show his works for Brazilian people. And even though it was in São Paulo, located the website in São Paulo, I think that Brazilians could see the work. But we didn't have much audience, by the way, I believe that, we would have more audience if we were at the museum than online. And I think that there are many things that we have to learn to reach audience, I think. First of all, we were losing the physical space of the gallery. It means that, you have to think in terms of the screens, the body, the looping, and we didn't have this online. So we had to engage people on live, interviews, and people, having this reception, and we're trying to understand, the reception. Anyway, we were not expecting lots of people, by the way, but at the same time, we were more interested in engaging people in a discussion. That's what we were, trying to do. I can send the link to Virginia, to Alice, and Alice can share, the online exhibition, and then we can talk a little about that.
Can I perhaps bring Will and Kitty in at this point, as we've moved sort of on to thinking about, sort of what's missing when one isn't exhibiting in the physical space and one moves on to online in your case, as you were discussing, Shani. Have you any thoughts? Anything that you'd like to comment on at this point?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the provocation, Virginia. I thought that was really interesting, and to start to draw those thoughts together about the things that haven't changed, things have just been exacerbated, I think is really, really helpful as a programmer to try and think, what we are doing and what we're not doing, and how we can sort of adjust that constantly, because I think it's quite easy. So I work with Lux Scotland, and we support artists moving image in Scotland across the whole country. And it's actually been an amazing opportunity to be working online and actually be able to access the whole of the country from Glasgow, which has been a wonderful challenge, but also, it's been a really successful move. It's something we've always wanted to do and now been able to do. And it's very easy to sit here and sort of congratulate ourselves thinking, oh yes, well, we've always wanted to do that and now we're doing it, and our audiences are across the whole country and it's really accessible, and we've quite genuinely got people not just across the very top to bottom of Scotland, but internationally as well. And we've got lots of parents who wouldn't be able to come otherwise, who, you know, looking after young children, breastfeeding mothers. You know, it's an amazing thing that we've been able to do. And you know, and then thinking about sort of physical access to the work, people, you know, who can then access the works from home, that we can introduce captions to screenings. There's so many layers of things that I think we can congratulate ourselves and the sector on being able to do. But then it's so important to come back and remember the things that you're not doing and the people that you're not providing for. And I think even when you started talking at the beginning about power and you know, to remind ourselves that we are, as an institution, as somebody who is selecting work by particular people, that, you know, we are framing, you know, we're part of that power structure. And to remember that, you know, what in so many ways was a sort of knee-jerk reaction of like, well, what's the first most important thing to do? And for us, it was to support the community of artists working in Scotland, and to try and, you know, roll out some way of, you know, encouraging them to be able to show work and then discuss work and to support the community. But simultaneously, then you sort of reinforce something that's maybe about sort of locality or parochialism, or, you know, so how do you sort of retain your international outlook whilst supporting a community? How do you sort of, yeah, basically keep disrupting each thing that you're creating? And I think, you know, conversations like this to, you know, start thinking about perspectives from the other side of the world and remind ourselves that as much as we're sitting here comfortably being accessible, unless we're sort of actively doing that, we're failing, or, you know, there's still work to be done. So yeah, I mean, there's so many different elements of this, but I think there's something else about just, you know, the move online, obviously focusing on single screen digital works, that you know are available on this format, makes sense at all on this format. And you know, at each stage you need to remind yourself, yes, isn't it great that we can do this thing, but what are all those other things that we're not doing? So yeah, lots to think about. I don't think I've got any solutions other than it's so useful to be prompted by other people to remind ourselves what we still need to do.
I think that's really interesting, and I was wondering as well about this kind of question of the sort of the kind of social experiences of watching that we've talked about, and whether like Will might come in and talk a bit about the Artist Film Network that you've been doing, which I think also relates to some of the things that Lux does, and this obviously something that we've thought about together over the years is kind of what it is that watching film in like a physical space together offers, kind of questions of like embodiment, I guess, and as well as sort of thinking, Virginia, you sort of talked about like the social in terms of the kind of silver screen experiences, and I thought that was very interesting, and but also this kind of, you know, what it is to sort of sense someone else's response to a film who's sat next to you. And I guess, Will, you've been thinking about how to kind of take a film network that's kind of got this kind of really strong sense of community and dialogue online, and kind of I just wondered if you could reflect on some of the strategies that you've used to kind of replicate that sociality online.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Yes, I mean, one of the things maybe to start with is that a lot of Pavilion's commissioning work historically has always relied very much, neither on the gallery or the cinema particularly, but on, different on site-specific kind of intervention in different types of spaces. And some of the things that we are planning and are on hold at the moment are things that really, rely on that type of working. But one of the things that I think we've sort of fallen back on really is this idea of the sort of social. So Pavilion runs the Artist Moving Image Network, which has been going since 2018. Was set up as a space for artists, programmers, curators, anyone really with an invested interest in artist moving image to come together on a regular basis. So yeah, prior to lockdown, we were doing that in person in Pavilion Space, which is a modest size space in Leeds city centre. And we were doing that every month. So it's kind of a critical forum for, watching work together, reflecting on work, both work that, members of the group are making, but also, things that people think would be interesting to look at together. Sometimes we have guests come in. So we took that, took that kind of model and just, moved it online. We upped the frequency of the meetings, so they happen every couple of weeks for a shorter space of time. They happen for 2 hours, and it's worked really well in that, prior to lockdown, if people moved away from Leeds, they kind of became a bit disconnected from those events, even though maybe they didn't want to be. So it's meant that a lot of people who have joined the group over the last couple of years have been able to come back in. People who are geographically separated, but also it's a very intergenerational group of people, ranging from people who are recent graduates, maybe 20, 21 years old, up to 82 years old, which is something that I think is really brilliant about the group. So there's probably about 40% of the members are, I would say, over 50. So out of necessity, really, I think we need to, continue to work in the way that we are doing, but also when it is possible to meet in person, to also look at having these two platforms running in parallel, really. So yeah, but it's people have really valued it. I did a kind of survey with the group in the last month, and people have really valued that sense of community and sort of regular point of connection with people, but have missed things like I think having cups of tea was mentioned earlier, and that is something that a couple of people brought up, that when we have our meetings in a space, we always have tea and we have a break where people can just chat to each other. So there's things like that where it's just a forum for people who would only really talk to each other at that meeting, sort of socially. That's we're sort of missing. It's hard to do that on Zoom. So.
Can I?
Oh, sorry, go on, Thea.
No. Jill, finish up and then I will pitch in.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it seems like these sort of the positives and negatives are kind of being raised together really interestingly, I think. And yeah, I mean, I think definitely, like, it feels like we are sort of valuing those spaces of kind of community more now that we are all online and working kind of very individually. And I think in a way, a sort of bits and bobs that I've been to, I think there's a kind of more of a of activity kind of generally. There's sort of maybe this kind of commitment or kind of like real sort of consistency of attendance at certain groups, which things we've done in our school, for example, which I think is to do with the sort of moments of kind of coming together, which are more unique, that they're being kind of valued more in some ways. But yeah, then those kinds of conversations that only happen when in the kind of in between spaces of something that's more kind of formal and organized, I think is kind of being missed. And I guess something that I wanted to put on the agenda for another question, point of discussion, maybe after Thea's spoken, is also the kind of, we've talked a lot about kind of audience access to work and the kind of question of who's programming work. And I wondered whether maybe kind of Kitty, with a sort of view of Scotland as a whole, kind of has a sense of whether this moment is democratizing who is kind of putting on events as well as who's coming to them. So I just wanted to kind of register that as a question at some point. But Thea, do you want to pick back up on what Will was saying?
Well, I think what I was going to suggest, sorry about the phone ringing in the background, will kind of segue into what you wanted to discuss as well, because I wanted to try and bring Carlos and Tallulah into the discussion here, and ask what their experience has been of the last 9-10 months from a sort of a more grassroots activist, artist curator perspective, because we've heard from sort of more formal experiences within institutions, although not all, you know, we're not talking, you know, Tate Britain and things like that, but yeah, I would like to know your experiences.
Yeah, Tallulah.
Sorry. Yeah, I'll just share a little bit about our experience here in Mexico of a feminist art project that we have been working on this year. So there's a lot I could say, but I think one of the most interesting things that's come up, it's kind of bounced off a lot of what the other speakers have been saying, are these issues of who's included and who's excluded, and what we can do to try to make sure that more voices are heard. And it's certainly something that we've been considering for the next round of the project that we've been working on. So just very briefly, what we did was we asked feminist artists and activists in Mexico to respond to COVID-19 from a feminist perspective in any kind of visual manner, any kind of artistic visual manner. And we had an overwhelming response, which has been particularly interesting because that was the only kind of parameter we put, was that it had to be a feminist response. And what was really interesting was the themes that kind of emerged organically from the activists and the artists who participated. And I think that particularly in terms of inclusive, who's been included and who's been excluded, what we can see is that there were certainly a lot more younger people who were involved, who responded to the call. And I think we can tell that by the fact there was a lot of digital art, which was sent to us. And I think that speaks to age, but it also speaks to levels of digital literacy as well, levels of socioeconomics, who has Illustrator, who has Photoshop, who doesn't. And also the theme that emerged that had the most content was around self-care and collective care. And that's certainly something that I think younger generations of activists are more kind of more familiar with and more prioritize a lot more in their work. And what I found very interesting was that the theme with the smallest amount of content was around care. And I think that that might be to do with just the practicalities of if the women who have this increased burden of care, which we know has taken place during COVID, probably just didn't have time to send anything to us to participate in the in our call out in the exhibition and subsequent colouring book that's come from the project. Or perhaps it's to do with how care is valued and how care is seen in society, and whether it's seen as something interesting or important or not. But certainly in terms of what we do next, we're really looking at this idea as well of how we can combine kind of physical public work with online work. Because we certainly thought as well at the beginning that a digital space was just open because whoever could access the internet would access the space. But that's of course not necessarily so, particularly when you put a feminist perspective on artwork. Who's already going to look at that and who's going to automatically feel excluded or not interested or not involved. So we're looking now at how we can kind of combine kind of your more traditional kind of street work, street art, with something in a public space as well. So that's been our experience, and I'll put in the chat as well the link to that project.
Well, in my case, I mean, thank you again. That's a very interesting question here. I would say that these months have been very productive and very interesting in many different reasons. I have to split because here in Cork, for example, the kind of events we've been organizing have worked quite well, but also have brought us, have put us in touch, let's say, with different audiences and have helped us expanding the original scope we had. I can mention, for example, a conversation we had on contemporary curating and cultural labor in Angola. We organized as part of the new BA in Portuguese Studies we have here at University College Cork, and I think that event was quite useful in the sense that it highlighted not just issues of accessibility in relation to who follows how, but also issues of how different people can still define themselves as creators, as creative individuals, and how important it is, for example, to bring issues, as Trullo was mentioning before, issues of care and collaboration, not just in relation to, not just as a topic, let's say, but also as creative curatorial strategies. And that's something we are realizing, that these online events are being quite useful. At the same time, I have to say, in relation to Virginia's topic, that that's also something that was there from the very beginning. So it's not a change, it's not something new. And I can mention in that sense that I just finished writing a book on a decolonial genealogy of our activism, which very much tries to center the idea that activism is something new and something Western. And in that sense, for example, I was doing research in Indonesia and exploring how different Indonesian collectives were already trying to deal with the digital divide and with differential and uneven accessibility to the internet by programming, for example, online, offline, different strategies, sorry. And that was back in 2018, and they've been doing that in a very successful way for decades, I would say. Same thing happens if we deal with, for example, bottom-up alternative artist major spaces in different, I can think about Angola, but also many other West African countries where there are already networks and very useful and very productive networks, and that's something that preceded, let's say, COVID, and that's something that has been a very valuable resource in trying to develop new approaches and to consolidate new communities and existing communities, I would say. So in that sense, as Virginia was mentioning, from my side, from my perspective, that has a lot to do with different art institutions. I would say that in many senses the digital is not new, and we may run the risk of believing this story of art platforms and gallery spaces becoming digital in 2020, when this is a process that was already ongoing, and this is a process that for many people is not seen as a solution to anything, because in a sense the main conversations that were going on, some of the main conversations that were going on, for example, the last 2 years, I would say, had to do with time and how do we relate with time, how can we invent and develop new strategies to provide, for example, care and communication and sociability in alternative ways. So this idea of saving art institutions and bringing these institutions back to normal, for me, is a very strange idea, actually, because in many senses the discussion that was going on before had to do with how, to what extent these institutions represented an art system that was not entirely useful and that was failing in many senses. So the idea of going back to that normal should be problematized to an extent. And I think creators and cultural workers are being very successful in that sense, and that's something I think we should incorporate. And just to conclude, another, again, from my perspective, that again has to do a lot with different kinds of gallery spaces within visual arts. Another big thing, another big topic that I'm finding is that many people are focusing on also precariousness and cultural labor and not just on accessibility, because in many senses I'm finding that the idea of organizing events that was, let's say, huge in March and April, at the very beginning, when there was let's say, an overcrowded digital space full of events. I can recall the experience of colleagues organizing one event every 3 days or 4 days. That was very much difficult to sustain. I think that some of the most interesting things I'm finding now is that people are starting to care about cultural labor and how time in relation to labor is managed again. And I think that's something very useful that is not new at all, but should be taken into consideration in the future.
Shall we, Jill, do you want to just then pick up and just remind us what your what your question was for Kitty? I'm going to just make you repeat it.
Yeah, I guess I was just wondering about your kind of experience of working across Scotland and with different artists and groups, and is it your experience that do you think there's more there's kind of more access to kind of curating and organizing of things, given that large institutions have been closed a lot of the time? Do you think it has kind of democratized curating in any way?
I mean, I think there's lots of different questions in there. I think in terms of audiences, definitely we are now able to work with people across the whole of Scotland in a way that we never could previously. I mean, we're a small team and we were traveling around the country trying to screen things in different places and work with different programmers and create networks, and that's all just sort of happened. It sort of exploded in a way that we couldn't have done without coronavirus. I think the other part of the question, though, that you asked previously, though, was about whether there were different people programming. And I think this conversation is prompting me to think about things that we're doing that we've maybe not realized. So we used to have a strong part of our program where we were inviting other programmers to program on our behalf for cinemas. And obviously, since the cinemas aren't in operation in quite the same way, that has declined. So actually, in terms of what we're doing, our opportunities of working with other programmers are not as great as they were previously, which is good to be reminded of. But of course, we do still work with other programmers on things like the Artist Moving Image Festival, and that sort of opens up the work that we do in a whole new way. Whether that's happening, sort of beyond our remit, I don't know. I think there's so much about having to just stable the ship, just to try and keep on doing what you were doing, that I think, and it's half, in having this conversation, that I'm realizing that we're all narrowing our focus in terms of just doing what the bare, not the bare minimum, but like looking at the sort of essential role of the organization. And that's maybe, there's various sort of versions of other activity that are sort of being forgotten or sort of neglected, and I guess a little bit of this thing of just thinking that, oh well, we will get back to doing that, and then the longer that's delayed, the more it actually just falls off your agenda completely. So it's good to be reminded of the narrowing of our focus, and as much as we're always trying to look beyond our own locale, it's easier to work with the people that you already knew, and the networks that were already existing, and that's what needs to be pushed. And all those things about we're not bumping into people, we're not having those sort of accidental encounters that we might have had previously. I think that's sort of narrowing a world, but so nice to meet so many new faces today, which does prompt a wider conversation for our work and the work of all the people that we're sort of associated with.
I could just jump in there. I mean, it's interesting, Kitty and Will, listening to you both, and you've talked about the advantages, the positives that have come out of this in terms of the socialization and the opportunity for people who maybe had moved on. And Will, you talked about people who'd moved on from Leeds but are able to get back and socialize and discuss. What about, can you give us a sense of what in terms of the actual experience of viewing moving images, how is that playing out then in the activities that you're doing? So Kitty, you're reaching more people, which is great, but how are they watching films, I guess, is the question. It's very straightforward.
We've been relying, we're trying lots of different things, but I think the thing that we're returning to most regularly is sending a link to work so that everyone watches it in their own time, so they maybe have it 48 hours before an event, and then we have the discussion together. So we're not having watch parties, so to speak, and we're not showing it on any, we're not reliant on a particular platform in that sense. It's sort of, can be on someone's website or on Vimeo, whatever it might be. So it's the conversation. But as we gear up for the Artist Moving Image Festival, which will be taking place next year, I mean, yeah, at the moment that has been a successful format, but we're definitely considering other ways of doing things as well. But yeah, I'd love to know from Will what you're using and what's been most successful.
Yeah, I mean, I always feel quite sort of wedded to the sort of primacy of the projection event, and that's something and the kind of liveness that comes with watching films in a space with people. So I kind of had to put that to one side very much. So when we have the artist moving image meetings, we do watch work together. I tried various different platforms and things out. Zoom isn't, as people will know, is not very good for screen sharing video. So we use a platform which synchronizes Vimeo playback. So when I press play, it plays for everybody. So everyone gets Vimeo quality, but we're watching at the same time, and it does work. Works well actually. One of it is a sort of third party platform. One of the things that I've found frustrating is not being able to have sort of some ownership over that, the interaction design of these things, which are often laden with adverts and things like that. And I know that it is something that we could build our own version of. It's something I've looked into. But again, it's the level of investment, and is it worth it for the amount of time we will need to use it for? But I know, people have. That was an important aspect to hold on to for me, was watching things together at the same time. During the summer, we did. We also do a kind of public showcase, if you like, of work by members of the group, and we invite a different guest curator each year to look at work being produced by the group, pick things out which are interesting to them for whatever reason, and to build, to add other international work to that, to create a kind of public, what would ordinarily be a series of screenings. So this year we worked with Miriam Moufley, who was one of the programmers of the Berwick Film Media Arts Festival, and also works for Africa in Motion Film Festival in Edinburgh. And we had a lot of discussion about how should we do this online. And again, like Kitty, we decided to opt for a kind of what I've come to think about as sort of time limited on demand. So having work available for a window of time. In our case, it was each group of works was available for 3 days over the course of a bit over a week. So there was this window of time that you could watch the work in, and then we also put other things around it. So we did some audio interviews, which just sorry, I'm being interrupted. What?
I needed a pen, I didn't realise.
But yeah, I think that came from, and that also was, the same method that Berwick Film Media Arts Festival really successfully used just a few weeks ago, and I think they, a lot of the early examples of people who had to immediately take their festivals online were using things like Vimeo streaming to, basically take what they would have been doing in a cinema into a kind of equivalent online format. And I think that was interesting for a time, but I think people got fatigue set in quite quickly. Certainly it did for me and people that I was speaking to. And also the time differences. While it's really great that work is available internationally, some screenings could be happening at 5 a.m. in the morning, and it's only streamed once. So I think, from that point of view, this kind of more time limited on demand format is one that I think for me works particularly well at the moment. So, but it does take away this, the liveness. But the liveness, I think, can be created elsewhere, and certainly when we did our week of stuff during the summer, the social media kind of activity around it, and the artists kind of been quite involved in that. really meant there was a sense of occasion still around the work. So,
and I wanted to sort of add to that really, but to think of it from actually a community perspective, because we talked about curation on an institutional or on a group level, and either from arts organisations or from artists and producers themselves, but there's a whole other constituency of people as well. And some of the previous research that I've done was one of the things that we did was we built an online platform. We built it was a free platform, no advertising, no connection to any other commercial platform, for people to do their own projects, curate things, tell stories, all those sorts of things. And it came out of something that somebody once said in a meeting, actually. They said, I want to curate YouTube without using YouTube. So we built a platform that works on hyperlinks. So we avoid big copyright issues. We allow people to connect anything that's available culturally, digitally online. So they're using digital assets, but also digitizing and teaching people how to digitize their own assets and put them into the conversation. And it's a platform called Yarn, which has been going for about 5 years now. And we've still got people using it, and we're just about to hopefully embark on a second version of it, a bit like a WordPress version. But that gets you out of that sort of relying on big organizations to deliver your content. But it also really means that cultural organizations perhaps need to think more about making more content available for people to work with themselves. So rather than curating on behalf of a community, you actually let the community curate themselves in terms of what they're interested in and what you can make available. And so the model that we worked on was around a copyright-free exchange, which allows people who put their own content up there to take it down whenever they want to as well. So it's ephemeral. It's not a repository, but it's a conversation space where projects live. And that might be something that's interesting to other people. So, but I'm just thinking of us thinking a bit more about it from a genuinely community or communities perspective, because obviously no two communities are the same. But is there a potential here, as you were saying, Virginia, this sort of optimism that actually organizations themselves might rethink their own attitudes towards the ownership of content as well?
Be interesting. Yeah, I'm not. I mean, one of the things with this sort of more time-limited, on-demand way of showing work, one of those limits is to do with licensing, and we paid the artists whose work we showed, and it can't just be available for a whole week. So, and I'm not sure. I'd be interested in what the Lux's experience has been in negotiating that, what must be a really difficult negotiation of screening fees versus exhibition fees,
it has. I mean, it has been, I think, but even before looking at screening fees, just the fees that you pay anybody to participate on something online, I think we've all had to work out what this new economy is, what time is worth, and so we've been trying to sort of work those things out, with both participation fees and screening fees, and then the duration of work. I mean, that it's all, we're still working it out, but I think the fees are maybe more consistent now. And then of course, when you're working with big or bigger distributors other than the single artist, and trying to negotiate how long a festival, because we work with a lot of different festivals, then negotiating on behalf of the festival essentially with the distributor of how long a work will be online, and that shifting in the planning process, because of course that's the other thing with all the festivals thinking, oh, it will be up for a day or be a single screening, or no, actually it's going to be 2 weeks, and we've been having to negotiate those things. But generally everyone's been really understanding of the fact that it's difficult, and I think people are clearer what their parameters are, what's okay and what's not. I think, Simon, your idea of having works more widely available is really interesting. I mean, there's a chat going around at the moment about how nice other people's websites are. Our website needs a lot of work, and it's, in terms of functionality, it can't really do anything. but we're working on that. And I think then, what we're looking at is something that's more akin to a directory, so that all of the works that we've shown previously, where the artist is happy to have those works available, they are then accessible through our website. Because I think, each artist that we work with has very different idea about how available their work should be. And I'm happy to pass that on to them, but to at least make the artist accessible. So you can go to their website much more easily than you can at the moment.
It just seems to me that there always has been a lot of effort and expenditure of public money on websites and platforms, and a sort of crossover between commercial platforms and big sort of multinational organizations that you probably really don't want to deal with, particularly issues around copyright and ownership. And is there some way of coordinating the sort of sense of what people need in terms of organizations of different scales? Then I think things would be a lot easier. So everybody's not trying to make their own bespoke website that's doing the same as everybody else's website, but just looks a bit different. And that's the sort of research we were doing, because from a community perspective, we were thinking about what people were using commercially and what their social media habits were, and to try and provide something that pulled everything into one place. So the whole process is really about orchestration. It's about bringing the elements that you want together in a common sort of piece of software that other people can use and adapt. So that's what we're working towards at the moment. But I know the struggle, because the funding issue of trying to make and do those adjustments to your own platform is out of the reach of most people at the moment as well. It's not, and it can't be a priority because jobs are the priority. But anything around those conversations I just think are really important.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the moment, sort of our take on it would be that there's been so much work being streamed. We're happy just to point towards it as opposed to trying to stream it ourselves, and actually, focusing on the conversation as opposed to the exhibiting of that work.
Yeah. That's something that we've done a lot with the Artists Moving Image Network as well, is to try to utilise what's available to look at, always with the permission of the artist and them knowing, that we would be looking at it as a group. But to just facilitate dialogue around work which is currently available either through an artist's own Vimeo page, or something that an organisation is streaming. Or we did one of our sessions happened during Berwick's festival, so we had Peter Taylor, who's the director, come along and talk about the festival, and looked at a couple of works. So kind of I suppose curating our way through what's already what's been made publicly available.
So someone has brought up the subject of hybrid format in the chat here, and I was wondering, Alice, if I could bring you in at this point as our representative of the Leeds International Film Festival, which has just recently taken place and took place. I think it was originally going to be hybrid, but it had to all be pulled at the last minute because of zoning and changes to lockdown rules, etc. So would you say a few words about that for us, please?
Yeah, of course. He's actually still online today, is the last day to watch films, but we'll also understand if everyone is fatigued with streaming things and would rather watch Uni Challenge. That's also acceptable tonight. But yeah, so the festival, so had to go. Well, it was always kind of planned to be a hybrid, or with the hope that physical screenings could take place, because I think for a lot of the team, it was obviously that was a very much important part of the experience, the festival experience. And, obviously that festival experience is tied up with the spaces, the atmosphere, the sociality, the community. And, I think we're always aware that you can't replicate all of those things with an online platform. Obviously, perhaps overly optimistic because the national lockdown came in basically a couple of days before the festival was due to launch, but we had put work into building an online platform. I would say I'm also aware that within a festival organization, it has the budget to build a platform from scratch, and there was a lot of work and research went into kind of you know, finding different options. And, you know, I don't think it was, you know, it was a costly platform, and you're also paying, you know, I guess paying for added levels of security. When you're having like an international festival, I think, you know, there's a sense that obviously like the sales agents and the distributors that you're working with expect high levels of like, you know, security, geo-blocking. So I think that's something that only really, you know, you have to have the budget to be able to do that. So yeah, I mean, I think in, you know, in some respects, it's, you know, it's been great. We've made a thing happen, and there is stuff online and you can watch it. And I think that is, you know, there's an amazing selection of films. But yeah, I think it's now, you know, did people engage with it? I don't know. Like, I would like those statistics, but I think, yeah, I'm kind of also aware that just sort of making the thing happen is not kind of, is enough, not enough really. But yeah, I think, I guess, yeah, for me, you know, the online element was always really important. And, you know, I've kind of enjoyed, you know, the accessibility that I've been able to have, you know, kind of dipping into festivals, you know, across the world. It's opened my access up to festivals that I wouldn't have had the time or the money to get to. But I'm also aware as like an industry professional that I think I've been better catered for than just general audiences in terms of that accessibility. And I think, you know, with things like, you know, industry panels, discussions, webinars, networking events that I don't think are necessarily laid on for, you know, for audiences. So I do think that like online festivals don't, you know, can't replicate or haven't been maybe replicating the kind of sociality as well as they could. I think, you know, for me though, that said, you know, something like Berwick, I think, you know, did do it really, really, really well. And things that I kind of appreciated were the kind of added conversations and events, Q&As, introductions, having a kind of that personal touch, that physical presence. I think you kind of run the risk if you just sort of put films on a platform and just sort of put it out there, you know, you kind of run the risk of just getting lost in the sort of sea of streamers and, you know, perhaps not being any different to another Netflix. So I think, yeah, for me, having an online festival, but putting the time in to do introductions, Q&As, added events, I guess making it feel more Lent helps. But yeah, but also as being said, you know, having access, you know, digital is obviously is a limited solution. Having access to internet devices and time to watch it is also, yeah, all really, really important. Think, yeah, it takes time to build an audience for a new platform. I think you can't expect regular audiences to just migrate over. And I think, because they won't. I think also I'm kind of thinking about when you take a festival into the domestic space, you're competing against so many other things and that are kind of pulling people's time and attention away. So, which is obviously it's other things to watch, but also, you know, your daily routines and, you know, duties of care and cooking the dinner. So I found as well as someone experiencing things online that I don't necessarily want it all just invading my domestic space. And I maybe make different choices when I'm watching things in the home as I would do if I was sort of traveling to a physical festival. I think your attention is not as concentrated. And yeah, not sure. I think that.
Can I say something about that? I mean, more of a sort of admission rather than anything else, really. But I found the difficulty with film festivals is that you tend to migrate to what you already know, and instead of being sort of pushed out of your comfort zone or forced to watch something either in you know to the end that you might not have otherwise watched, you can use all those other excuses. Or I've been on the computer too long today, or I've got other things I need to be doing. And I'm finding that quite limiting. Like I'm finding my research, I think it was Virginia, you'd said, you know, just being sort of forced to pay attention to this, and through this invitation, it's really important to be, to push and to know like when to push yourself is really hard, I think, because we're also having to take care of ourselves through all of this. So yeah, I don't know if anyone else has any advice or thoughts on how to go beyond your comfort zone.
I don't necessarily have advice on it or thoughts on it, but yeah, it kind of, I feel like that reverberates a lot with what we experienced as well, in terms of people who already who already identified as feminists would be much more likely to identify with or to interact with the work that we put online. And I suppose that we kind of know more about how physical spaces are accessible and who they're accessible to and who they exclude. And there's been quite a lot of research on that, obviously. And I don't know if there's as much or what's going to come out of what the changes we've seen this year in terms of, thinking about how digital spaces are accessed, and particularly not just in terms of who has the internet, but kind of how you as a person identify with what you're going to watch. And particularly, as other speakers have mentioned, there's certainly, I think everybody's noticed a fatigue with online events and webinars and so on. And we certainly noticed dwindling engagement with our project from April, May to now, as people are trying to get back into this sense of going back out there into the world. Especially in Mexico anyway, there's a lot more public events happening again, well, kind of public life happening again, not events, but life. And people are certainly choosing to go out and be with other people, I think, and to be in the streets and to be in towns where they can, because there's been a long time where people haven't been able to do that. Definitely this idea of kind of hybrid delivery in the future, I think, is certainly a really good way forward to try and include as many people as possible.
If I could just pick up on that point as well, I think it's interesting as well, because it highlights quite how much we might be out of sync with one another, even if we just think about the situation in Mexico versus the situation in the UK, where it's getting colder and it's, we're in a lockdown and then sort of approaching a period of likely to be in many more lockdowns. But it also makes me think about when you are trying to think about your theoretical digital audience and you're trying to say, well, where are they in the world? What time is it there? How can I not, going back to what Alice said, interrupt times when someone might be picking up their children from school or cooking the dinner, because these are times that are pinch points for certain people that we want to connect with. And if you're also thinking about time zones and all of these other things, and whether in another part of the world it is more open, I currently work with a number of people in New Zealand where the context is really different. And so trying to connect digitally, especially when our context is so different, is also just really challenging, isn't it? And whereas to a certain extent, if everyone's in the same physical space, you know that they're there right now. You might not be aware of whether they're hungry or whether they're thinking about, what they should be doing. But you to a certain extent control the environment, whereas we actually have very little control over the environment. And I think I really like the idea of this kind of invasion of domestic space as well, because I think along with the fatigue of kind of the end of the day, some of us don't necessarily have the domestic space either, like the physical space. I mean, I'm quite lucky in that I have a separate office, so I can do this and shut the door. But as Will demonstrated earlier, people can come in and they can interrupt you. And whether they're likely to interrupt you or not has a bearing on what we were talking about earlier. If your child is autistic, explaining that to them that they just can't come in and see mummy at a certain point. I don't have this issue, but these again kind of affect what our domestic space actually is so incredibly variable. And I think I'm also really mindful as well, just as a final point, when I speak to a lot of my students wherever they are in the world, a lot of them are in a single room, so their domestic space is so incredibly contained that actually it's not even necessarily going to be a pleasurable experience for them to engage with anything online, because it's still bounded by a very small actual bit of physical space.
Will, you mentioned, you used the word success or successful at one point when you were describing the events, that you've been organising, and Kitty, you've talked about, being happy with how things have gone. So I'm just wondering, are we noticing a shift in how we define a successful film screening, in the sense that we're more focused perhaps now on the discussion and the number of people who show up for the discussion afterwards, rather than the bums on seats kind of phenomenon? Do people sense that there's a kind of a shift in how we are, sort of thinking about how successful what we do is?
I don't know if this is an immediate answer to that, but in terms of the it's not quite about success, but like whether it's here to stayness, the permanence of this. We were asked by one of our funders about a program that we're running next year, which we're proposing currently, that there will be events taking place on a regular basis throughout the year online. And they said, well, if lockdown eases, then how are you going to fund it? How's that going to happen? And we were very clear that actually that strand of our program will remain online. There are so many advantages for that will continue. That certainly doesn't mean that all the work we're ever going to do is going to be online. That would be, that wouldn't help us at all. But to be able to have the hybrid program going forward is, would be successful. Desirable.
I think it's similar for us. That I think there'll always be some element of online programming which is continues that wasn't there before, and in terms of what success looks like, it's the numbers of people who attend our meetings hasn't dwindled. It's gone up, and there can be, on a regular basis, at least 15 people at each meeting, up to 25 people. Even for a screening of artist moving image, that would be quite good in some instances. So I think, with artist film, bums on seats has never really been a measure of success, I would say. And also, I did curiously projected a 16mm film just as the projectionist for DocFest back in October, and there were not very many people there at all. This is in Sheffield. It was a 4-hour film that was only available on 16mm, and there were a very small number of people there, but that felt like a success. So.
If you can just jump in there, I was thinking about an initiative, for example, we organized with Latin American with street artists from Latin America living in Ireland, and for me that event was quite successful because it was an event organized in collaboration with them, and the audience was not an academic audience, was also not an audience of people, let's say, working in the music sector, the film sector. But also moving from place to place. So in that sense, numbers, I would say, are useful, but also the kind of engagement we get and the kind of dialogue we can generate could also be thought as a way of measuring the impact of these events. But again, that's nothing new. That was something that I would say was always there in a sense.
I'm very conscious of the time. We have 4 minutes left, so I'm just. Oh, I've got an echo going again.
Talk a little?
If anyone has any last sort of thoughts that they wish to share, then please do.
I just wanted to say thanks firstly to Virginia for such a great provocation. And I think it's really opened up lots of really interesting channels for discussion. So obviously we're not going to reach any conclusions today. This is just a sort of starting point of our thinking. But I was being really sort of, my mind's ticking over lots now, which is fantastic. So I think we've really succeeded in that, and everybody's made a really fascinating contribution as well. So I hope these conversations can continue, and obviously as a group, we will try and facilitate more of these conversations. But I just wanted to say, I think it's been really fruitful, and it's really helped to focus, certainly my thinking about things at the moment.
If I can just say thank you for the thank you, and also to pick up on what Kitty was saying about how do we find the space for these things. I just want to thank Steph for inviting me, because it made me have the space, but also think about how I can continue to try and find the space, because this has been a really fascinating discussion. It's reminded me why I do what I do and why I love it. And so, yeah, thank you, everyone. I'm really excited to look at all the websites and projects that everyone's doing and to continue these conversations.
Yeah, brilliant. And can I say a huge thank you to Alice for facilitating this and organising this event for us. And it's gone very smoothly, much more smoothly than it would have gone had I been organising it myself. I just wanted to flag up a couple of events that we've got coming up as part of our Sadler seminar series that I think you all will potentially be very interested in. And the first is with Janaína Oliveira, who's an academic activist and one of the most influential names in Black film curation in Brazil. Janaína runs Ficine, which is a forum dedicated to promoting links between Black filmmaking in Brazil and across the continent of Africa. And she was invited to run the prestigious Flaherty Film Seminar in the States a couple of years ago. And she'll be giving a webinar on the 18th of January. And then on the 11th of February, we have another webinar, and that is with Sandra Benites, who's the first Indigenous curator of any museum or gallery space in Brazil. And Sandra is now the adjunct curator of Brazilian art at MASP, São Paulo's Modern Art Museum. And if you'd like to know more about her, she was the feature of a really interesting article in New York Times in May this year. So that's the 18th of January, 11th of February. And we will also be hosting a conference, an online conference, unfortunately online, which will be in April, and we'll be sending out more information about that presently. So yes, just thank you very much indeed to all our speakers, to Virginia, to Alice for organising, and I do hope that we can continue these conversations as Simon says. Thank you very much.